Okay, I'm now recording. Cool.
Perfect.
So Paul, are you here now as well? Let me just check. Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so the way I'm going to give a general introduction into molecule, kind of the protocol, what our thinking is, kind of how this idea came about, who we see this really being for. And then my hope was that you guys would have questions and we could kind of proceed with this as if it were just a dialogue or kind of like a Q&A. There's a lot of areas. This is still quite a conceptual thing for us in some ways. There's still some massive open questions, both technical and legal, that come into this. But we're really happy to discuss those things with you guys in an open way, and hopefully get some interesting feedback from your side as well. For those of you who don't know, and I'm not sure if Tristan was able to give an overview into what Molecule is, but really this is a blockchain-based protocol for the open development of molecular structures. The idea is that we're trying to create a distributed research and development platform for any type of chemical IP, any type of therapeutic process, whether it be a drug delivery system, a novel therapeutic regimen, a single compound. And really the core design goal with this is to distribute the cost and risk and ownership of drug development by creating open markets for intellectual property. And within that goal, what we hope to do is to align kind of all of these stakeholders that play a role in the drug development process, whether it be academia, so researchers, for example, any type of pharmaceutical company, so those that are focused on drug development, for example, from very small pharmaceutical companies that might only have one or two drugs that they're developing to very large pharmaceutical companies, consumers, so patients, biotech companies, biotech traders, investors, regulators, and lawyers. So to try and create an open ecosystem that aligns all of those stakeholders with the interest of more quickly and more readily bringing drugs to market, and also trying to develop IP that might not be developed otherwise. One, because it's not economically incentivized for a pharmaceutical company to do so, which would be the case with like an orphan drug. So if you have, for those of you who don't know, an orphan drug refers to a drug for an orphan disease, which is a rare disease. Often these things aren't in the financial interest of pharmaceutical companies. And this protocol is being developed by a Swiss nonprofit foundation. So we're trying to create an even playing ground for this ecosystem in the future of pharma. This project came about really in response to the innovation crisis that's ongoing in the pharmaceutical industry. For those of you that don't know, just some figures, on average it costs, and this comes from a Tufts University study that was a little bit controversial, so take this number with a grain of salt, but on average it costs about $2.5 billion to bring a drug to market. And as you can imagine, what that does is it really forces a lot of smaller players out of the market, and also creates a situation where pharmaceutical companies must see a return on their investment and must really, because of that, have blockbuster drugs that they're bringing to market. And this would be the case where you don't see a lot of new drugs coming to market for Hunter's disease, for example, or Werner syndrome, these kind of rare diseases. But there's often new insulins, new blood pressure medication, cancer drugs coming to market, because there's going to be rapid uptake of these drugs by patients. These are fairly widespread diseases. The drug development process is painstakingly slow. It's about 12.3 years to market from the point of discovery, and very risky. The average drug success rate for commercialization is 0.012%. Adding to that problem, R&D is typically relatively closed source and intransparent. As many of you know, there's a crisis in science right now with regards to negative data publishing and reproducibility. It tends to be monopolistic and non-collaborative, and really revenue is what is driving innovation in a sense when it comes to bringing things to market. Coupled with that, public trust is at an all-time low in the pharmaceutical industry. People really don't trust these institutions anymore. So there's a lot of ways to potentially address this problem. People have tried open innovation. There's people doing some interesting things with this open pharma movement. So moving away from patents, trying to ride on like exclusivity and trust, for example, in some cases. But what we wanted to try to approach this problem slightly differently. What you'll see in a lot of cases is people trying to indict the pharmaceutical industry by bashing it and saying negative things about it. This is unfortunately not always the best way to get people on your side. And what we're trying to do, and what has been particularly difficult, even with coming up with a branding for this, and just thinking about how we communicate these ideas, is try to create a situation where we can get the pharmaceutical industry and academia and independent researchers and all the stakeholders in this aligned, so that people can work together. What Molecule ultimately represents is a protocol to distribute pharmaceutical IP. So I'm just going to briefly try to walk you through what creating a market for a compound would look like. And Paul, Liesel, feel free to hop in at any point if you have something to add. But let's say I'm an independent researcher at a university and I make a discovery. So I discover a new compound that I believe could be useful to treat X or Y disease. And let's say it's a small molecule that I believe could be utilized in cancer research. If I patent that, there's a cost associated with that, but that cost is not nearly as large as the cost of actually developing that drug. So it might be tens of thousands of dollars to patent that. Now, at this point, I have a patent on that, but there's many preclinical processes and ultimately clinical trial processes that would have to take place for that drug to actually come to market. So the bulk of that, there's many discoveries that are made, for example, that ultimately go undeveloped because the resources simply are not there to develop the drug. This is highly variable, but for example, if let's say I discover a novel gram-negative antibiotic, I might spend $50,000 to patent that. But then to get that drug from the point of patenting to Clin 1 might be around $4 million. And then those prices increase dramatically depending on the number of patients that are involved in your clinical trial, the size of that clinical trial. You're looking at anywhere from $10 million to $15 million per phase for developments, which prices a lot of smaller players out of that market. So let's say I have a patent. I can go onto Molecule and create a market for that patent. What I would do as the discoverer and as the owner of that IP, I would retain, let's say, a 20-30% stake. The stake could really be anything. And then the remainder of that, I would actually relinquish ownership of that patent to a smart contract, create a market on Molecule, and the parameters of that market are defined. I don't know how familiar everyone is with token bonding curves, for example, but token bonding curves are essentially a mechanism that binds price to supply. So at any given supply, however many of these tokens, which represent ownership in that IP, are circulating, we know what the price would be. So essentially, token bonding curves act as a market maker. They will accept collateral and give tokens, which represent shares in that IP, and they will accept tokens and give collateral or cash in exchange. So basically, you have this market maker that will always buy or sell you shares in that IP. And what this does is it allows us to create a mechanism for price discovery. So I might have let's say some pharmaceutical IP, I don't know what it's worth. I can set the initial share price, and if people do begin to buy along this curve, we can see that interest exists in this compound and in this compound's market. There's a lot of downchain processes that still need to be developed, but essentially, capital would be staked into that curve, and that capital represents a pool of liquidity. So as the price increases, people could sell out of that market. But similarly, with some governance, and let's say the majority shareholders in these markets would have chairs on a board and would be able to make some decisions around governance, they could make decisions around what that capital that has been staked into this bonding curve could be used for. And let's say it's further drug development. It could be paying administrative fees, for example, paying for an IND or NME fee when opening a clinical trial. But really the goal with this is to allow people to create markets for pharmaceutical IP, people to collaborate around research pertaining to that IP, and then develop the drug in an open and transparent way where even retail investors can get involved. Somebody who's affected by a disease could fund the development of a drug or support the development of a drug that was relevant to their disease, et cetera. Does that make sense so far to everyone?
So does the token, the bond that you're buying, does that represent a unit of the finished product, or does it represent like a share of the profit from sales or?
So, okay, that's a great question. What it would initially represent would be a stake of ownership in the patent itself, but also some stake in the pool of liquidity that exists in this market. And ultimately, depending on how, so if that drug ultimately does make it to market, which, as you probably understand, could be a 10-year, 12-year process, it would mean some form of royalties when that ultimately does make it to market. So the owners of these tokens would belong to, let's say, a patent investment trust. That patent investment trust, which would have some governance function, and that governing body would be able to make decisions about the commercialization of the drug, who can produce the drug, etc. But there's still many open questions around this. Paul, do you want to add anything to that with regards to what the ownership actually represents when they own these compound tokens?
Yeah, absolutely. If I can quickly jump in. Tristan, thanks again for putting this together. That's great. The dominant way that we're looking at this is through the lens of patent ownership, as like the underlying legal reason, like the legal security to invest in these markets in the first place, or for anyone to get involved. And the patent in that way is also a legal security, in the sense of, once, let's say you're a researcher and you buy into a certain market, you now own a share of that patent, which means you have a positive right to research that drug. So that's one important consideration, because if I'm a biotech company and we own a patent, that patent from a legal perspective means that no one else is allowed to research it or publish anything about it. So that's one important distinction. But so we're predominantly looking at it through that lens, because that's where a big market obviously is, and where the music is at the moment. But I personally believe that in the future, that will increasingly move away from patents, as we have in the software industry. And there we're looking at a variety of ways how to commercialize a drug or a compound without the use of a patent, which then means you would kind of have this open source community form around this potential compound, and have similar developments as you would have in the open source software industry.
Yeah, and this is pretty critical for us, but it's a black box in some ways as well. So if you don't have a patent, for example, but we had a conversation recently with a guy called Matthew Todd, who's part of the open source pharma movement, and they're trying to bring together a community of people to work on things like mycetoma, for example. There's the open source malaria movement, and they're trying to do this without patenting. So but they also would like to commercialize this in some way, so that the people who have invested into these therapeutic pipelines could potentially, if not make money on the investment, at least be reimbursed for what they've contributed. But you do get into these interesting questions about, if there isn't some legal protection, such as a patent, for example, you can't necessarily stop someone from coming in and competing with you. So what you hope to do, and this is true of, it just really comes down to thinking about these things in a different way, perhaps more like open source software, for example, where you have something that, I guess, de-incentivizes someone coming to market and competing with you, just because you either have a good product, there's lots of uptake, or it wouldn't make financial sense for them to do that because you're able to put these things out at a very low price, because they're not traditional, traditional for-profit products in that sense. But yeah, does that make some sense?
Yeah, so just owning a single share is enough to then start doing research on the compound.
So in theory, yes, but you can imagine if people wanted to game this system, then what types of problems could be introduced. So just to paint a picture for you, and these are not necessarily insurmountable things, but these are open problems that we're thinking about. If these markets are priced, well, let's forget price. If a pharmaceutical company with a competing drug wants to get insight into what another pharmaceutical company is developing, they could come onto this platform, in theory, buy a single share, and then have information about what a competitor is developing. So the kind of catch, yeah, these are things that we're trying to work out. What we would like to do is create an open, transparent system where if a researcher with an interest in a compound, he could come in, could buy a single share, and could then have research rights. They could be able to publish on these things, especially if it's post-patent. Because we also want to innovate in a space where, let's say someone's doing a mass screen on potential targets for X disease, they don't necessarily want to patent these things. In theory, you could create markets for some of that, I guess not intellectual property, but for those types of compounds and for funding the development of these compounds on these markets. But there's just nothing to prevent someone else from coming in, developing something similar and commercializing it. So yeah, there's some, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Paul, but these are challenging questions that we're trying to address, and we're really trying to figure out a way to move away from patent ownership in the pharmaceutical space, because that monopolization is ultimately what is, in a lot of ways, the fact that single entities are having to shoulder the cost of development and then have protection on that so that they can recoup their investment is what is obviously driving, in some ways, very high drug prices. But that is a systemic change that presumably is going to take some time. It's like trying to steer an iceberg. But yeah. But what I hope is that, in the future, so for example, something like if a biohacker, for example, identified a off-patent compound, let's say something that we were working on in the biogerontology space, for example, is nicotinamide riboside, which there have been companies like Elysium that have tried to patent special formulations of this compound coupled to another antioxidant or something like that. But if I had an interest in, and I had a dosing schedule, and I had basically a therapeutic pathway for which somebody could dose nicotinamide riboside or any other off-patent compound, you could create a market for something like that on this platform and try to get others who had an interest in that to fund it. And some of these things, this could be in the supplement space, for example, wouldn't necessarily need to go through a clinical trials process. In that case, you could basically source investment from the community in general that had interest in this, same with research chemicals, and ultimately gain enough momentum to commercialize these things without going through a pharmaceutical process, a clinical trials process. Does that make some sense, Paul? Paul, are you there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's spot on.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, what I would like, there's a lot of intricate working elements to this and things I would like to get into maybe over subsequent conversations. But what I was hoping to do, just because I'm not sure how much time everyone has, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts, kind of hear about the projects that you're working on, what you're interested in, and try to see what we would hope is to really mobilize you guys as a kind of some early adopters of this platform, people who have ideas, who would be interested in trying to utilize this as a funding platform for those ideas. And we would like to understand the ways in which we could cater to you and cater to some of your ideas. I don't know if Tristan, if you would want to kick that off just into some of your recent approaches to biohacking, some of the interesting things you're working on. We'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, so not just, there's a particular gene vector for delivering antibodies to suppress HIV, but I think that there's the question of like the platform itself, which could be interchangeable for other genes as well. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, Mac, or do you want to, is that enough?
Yeah, I would like to. I've also got a couple questions, but I can also talk about our project. So my name is Mac. I'm a biohacker. I've worked with Tristan for the past couple years. And, right now I have a pharmaceutical startup, and we have this vector. And I'm both interested in moving past the patent process. I'm curious if you've given any thought to, rather than tying the bonding curve market to the patent, tying it to something like a GitHub or a research repository that includes the maybe clinical research that, or preclinical research that had been done on that molecule. But in terms of what we're working on, we have what we believe through in future research may prove to be a robust expression vector that can express any antibody, and for hopefully years. It may turn out to be months.
So this is really getting into drug delivery type things, or antibody delivery, correct?
It's definitely a gene therapy.
Okay.
And any gene therapy does have a drug delivery aspect to it. But one of the problems that I'm also running into, that I'm looking possibly towards a distributed blockchain method of research, investment, regulation, and distribution, is if we can show that this one antibody works and is safe and effective and expresses for a long time, and that would mean that we could stick in just about any similar antibody. And that's a huge market. Those are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of different drug candidates that we could instantly have. And how do we bring those to market if not with some type of system like this? We could start by just doing a couple and going through the regular process, and we're going to have to do that just to prove that we have, just as proof of concept, that we can do it and that it works. But after we've done that, what do we do? How do we gauge market interest, and not only pricing, but these things are, there's that, I think it was JP Morgan report that was like, oh, curing diseases is not yeah. So, I came into this not caring about that. I'd rather cure the diseases first, and then we'll see how much money comes in afterward.
Mac, if I can maybe quickly jump in. So great comments. Thank you. Two things that you mentioned. So first of all, let's say you have one lead treatment, but then you have all of these branches subbing off, and you don't know which ones might be effective, and you don't know which ones might not be effective. I don't know how familiar you are with bonding curves, but something that we've been working around, this gets a little bit more technical, are nested bonding curves, where you can, let's say you have a mother curve, which would be like your first discovery, and then you have essentially bonding curves branching off of that mother curve, and some of them might be completely inactive, but others might get very active. And this is kind of then where the knowledge of the crowd becomes interesting, or this whole concept of curation markets, that you would let's say, the community or the people that are interested in your compound actually figure out which, let's say, phenotypes, which types might be interesting. So you have this concept of branching out into subcurves from an initial discovery. Obviously, this whole thing, this doesn't make much sense then anymore from a pure existing patent system perspective. But those are some of the more let's say, the technical considerations that we're taking into account as we're building this.
Paul, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Just there's 10 minutes remaining on this Zoom call. Do you have any idea how I could lift that time limit?
It might be easiest just to send a new link to everyone.
Okay. Okay, yeah, guys. So just so you know, this will cut out in about 10 minutes, but I'll create another.
Okay, got it. Well,
yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean,
I can respond unless you wanted to go.
No, please.
Okay. Yeah, I do know a good bit about bonding curves. I'm not a bonding curve programmer or anything, but I hadn't thought of the concept of branching curves. That sounds really interesting. That sounds, like it kind of centralizes the risk of the mother curve. I don't know how easy it is to, the whole point of the bonding curve is probably you you have limited access to changing the function of the curve after it's produced. But I guess my next question is, where are you guys in terms of your infrastructure? If I wanted to be an alpha tester who was actually doing R&D and trying to bring drugs to market, how soon could I test your system and give you feedback on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a POC, which is kind of like the first end-to-end system that should be running on a testnet, with an interface and everything that should be ready by the end of this month.
Okay.
We're then kind of going to take into like first, I wouldn't say actual testing rounds, but like, let's say user feedback, looking at all the missing parts, looking what doesn't make sense. I mean, this is from some perspective, it's a highly economic and game theoretic system as well. So there's a lot of parameters that I think we need to stress test, like attack vectors that we need to alleviate or first of all discover. And I think then from a longer term perspective, I think we might have a beta potentially in 6 to 12 months. Those are kind of the timeframes that we're looking at. To be honest, if the whole system like live, let's say in the public domain, like as a public utility network, would most likely only be in early 2020. What might be though is that we have a first, and I'm just being realistic here because I know software development and things normally takes a lot longer than anticipated. I'm sure it's similar in the biohacking sphere. And what we will do though is that we will probably have 10 to 20 compounds that we'll launch the protocol with in a slightly restrictive fashion initially, just to be able to make sure that everything is working smoothly. So our plan also isn't to just put it out there and then see what happens, but really to work with specific user groups from different parts of the pharmaceutical space. To kind of launch the protocol with. And then,
okay,
I mean,
well, I'd love to be in one of your user groups. Go ahead, sorry.
No, sorry, I didn't catch your last comment.
Oh, I was just saying I'd love to be in one of your user groups when you're ready for that, or apply if you're considering, having a limited cohort.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That'd be wonderful. It'd be great to chat further.
So just, I'm going to back up and maybe give clarity for some other people who might be watching.
Okay.
So like the idea with these markets is that you could gauge user interest in the market, and might there be an option for if there isn't a sufficient amount of money raised to do a clinical trial or what have you, it could be automatically returned to the funders? Is that the idea, or is it just like you have to initiate the sale of the token back, and it's probably going to be less than what you paid to get that token?
Sorry again, Tristan. I cut out for a second. You're referring to how the funding mechanisms would work.
Yes.
Yeah. So from a first perspective, so with a pure vanilla bonding curve model, the initiator doesn't actually make a sale. So he kind of gives away his ownership to that smart contract. And then anyone who starts buying in after him contributes liquidity or collateral to that contract. And what it now means essentially, it doesn't essentially mean that you're doing, so this isn't the ICO model that blockchain kind of got famous with 2017. It's really a liquidity model, which means that if other people start buying into your market, you now have liquidity for whatever you're developing, which means you can sell shares back to the market and take collateral out of it. It's kind of all that a bonding curve does essentially is it buys and sells shares. It takes in money and gives out tokens, and it takes in tokens and gives out money. So the initiator doesn't get any initial funding. He only gets funding once there is actual interest from, like, let's say from the crowd. Having said that, though, there is multiple models where you can actually get recurring, let's say, recurring income from the curve in the form of like a development tax, for example, where a core development team could could get a percentage of sales that come through the curve. There's also in the one,
Paul, it's worth mentioning that so if something did potentially fail let's say something failed clinical trials or the market was going to cease, in theory, it could be possible to lock up that curve and at least partially reimburse people for their investment. You are maintaining a pool of liquidity that could be utilized in that way, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's correct. It's also just something. The
Yeah,
initiator
like
doesn't get money. Yeah, Tristan, did I answer your question?
Yeah, that answers that.
So what's your take on securities law? What are you expecting in terms of any compliance, or are you guys thinking you're going to have a nice medium-sized window of time to do experimentation and stuff before anything happens?
Yeah. So there's two routes to go down here. The one route is the patent route. If we're talking patents,
Just quickly, there's less than a minute left in this meeting. I'm just going to end this and start another one before Paul launches into his thought.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, see you now.
Yeah, everybody copy the link. It's in the group chat, or message me on Telegram and I'll send it to you.
Oh yeah.
And Tyler, just give Zoom a minute to process the recording and it will save it to your machine.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to end this now and then we'll start back up.